Georgian townhouses on the moon, the highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way. Small modular reactors under every village green. This is Anglofuturism.
Hello and welcome to the Anglofuturism podcast. I'm Calum Drysdale.
I'm Tomo. We come to you with something of an unexpected broadcast. As we were returning from snowy southern climes, we took a brief detour over the Indian Ocean.
The plan, at least, was to lower our newly installed fire pole, slide down and have a day out at the beach.
I'm still adjusting to the fire pole, frankly. The asbestos trousers that you make us wear, Callum, still chafe all the way down.
The way down's the best bit, Tom. Although I do admit that shinning our way back up 3 kilometres is a bit of a chore.
It's easy enough, mate.
Maybe with quads like yours. Nevertheless, as we were putting on the handbrake, we received some troubling news. The future of our day out at the beach was at risk after the government announced that it had reached an agreement with Mauritius over the sovereignty of the Chagos Islands.
Listeners, I can honestly say that I've never seen Callum so angry.
Our day out at the beach was threatened.
Angry enough that you have turned to the courts.
That is quite right, Tom. I have submitted a pre-action letter to the government, the first step towards a judicial review, questioning the legality of the government's actions handing over the Chagos Islands to Mauritius.
And before we go on, I want to get across to listeners exactly what Callum is doing. If you're familiar with the little girl facing down the bull, there's a statue of this on Wall Street in the US. Callum is basically the Anglofuturism equivalent of this. The bull is the structure of woke legalism, with Keir Starmer and Lord Hermer and Philip Sands and so on. And he might well end up in court defending the Chagos Islands against this land grab. It's highly Anglo-futurist conduct, and we at the podcast are very proud of him. But it has occurred to us that there might be listeners who are not as obsessed with the Chagos Islands as we are. And we are going to have to spend some time telling you about what the British Indian Ocean Territory is. And, well, I was going to say that maybe listeners will need to know what a judicial review is, but I assume that everyone like us is steeped in these waters constantly and thinks of nothing else but how awful they are and how much they hold the country back.
I think, Tom, you are quite right to be horrified. And even as I submitted this pre-action letter, I was holding my nose at the horror of using such a blunt instrument. But as Anglo-futurists, we have to use all the weapons at our disposal to try and hold up what I would say is potentially even treasonous behaviour from the government, handing over sovereign British territory.
We will return to this matter of the enemy's weaponry and of sovereignty and of judicial review, but I think it would make sense first to talk about the Chagos Islands themselves.
Yeah. So, Tom, I'll give you some context. The Chagos archipelago forms in its entirety the British Indian Ocean Territory. And these are a small collection of islands sitting around the same latitude as the Horn of Africa, sort of Somalia, Kenya area. And there is very little around them. And these are tiny islands. And we listeners might question why we possess the islands, and it was actually after our great victory over Napoleon that they were ceded to us
by the French.
So they were French territories, and they were useful because it was both a plantation and a point in the Indian Ocean for ships travelling around the Cape and towards the Indies.
And I think a key point to remember here is that before the Europeans settled them, and I think the Portuguese were the first to be active there in perhaps the 16th century, these islands were uninhabited. They have not been wrested from a native population in the way that many countries in Africa were.
Yeah, exactly. These are 7 tiny atolls in the Indian Ocean. And they were given to Britain post Napoleonic Wars and used as plantations. So there were plantations on there with imported workers from India and Africa.
Oh, when you say imported, were they slaves?
There were some slaves and there were some indentured workers, so workers who would come and then pay off the price of their transport. Then in the 20th century, with the end of empire and decolonization, these tiny islands became important once again because obviously we were at the height of the Cold War, and the Americans asked us whether they could host a base on these islands. They're well positioned for access to the Middle East and also controlling shipping going across the Indian Ocean.
And that's because they're basically used as an airstrip, right?
It's an unsinkable aircraft carrier that you can that you've plonked down right in the middle of the ocean. And so this agreement was made between Mauritius, which was slowly heading towards independence.
Well, tell us why Mauritius is relevant here.
Well, Mauritius. So when the territories were handed over by France, it was as a single province that included both Mauritius and the Chagos archipelago. And it's worth noting here that Mauritius itself is over 2,000 kilometers away to the southwest. So it's not a case of a contiguous or collected group of islands.
Or people,
exactly. It was effectively for the ease of the French administrators that these were governed as a single possession. And so the Americans asked in early 1960s for a base on these islands. And the crux of the matter is that even before independence, it was agreed with independence leaders that these territories would be separated and that they would form two separate legal entities. And the payment for this was £3 million. And as a result, Mauritius agreed to give up sovereignty over this area. And the Americans built this base, and and Britain has a role in this, we expelled the Chagosian people, many of whom were sent to Mauritius, where they were treated very poorly. And
South London.
Well, exactly. And that came later, where we accepted that we had mistreated the Chagosians when we expelled them between 67 and 73. And so in 1982, we accepted that we'd wronged them and gave many of the Chagosians British citizenship, and many of them moved to near Crawley, where there is now a fairly large Chagosian diaspora and community. And we gave them £4 million on the condition that they
or between all of them
for the people, which was meant to act as both restitution, and also they accepted that they would then give up rights to return to this island.
How much was that per person?
Well, the compensation was 4 million, and there were approximately 1,000 Chagosians who were expelled from the archipelago, which means that compensation was approximately £4,000 per person. Although, given that this money was given to the Mauritian government and passed on was their responsibility, there have been allegations that this was not fairly done, and that compensation largely consisted of limited quantities of low quality housing.
And the Mauritian government is very allergic to the idea that the Chagosians are an independent people. And there's actually a law in Mauritius that says that punishes with up to a 10-year jail sentence anyone misrepresenting the sovereignty of Mauritius over any part of its territory. And that includes Chagos Islands. And it's important to state, this is extraterritorial. So this means anyone speaking about this outside of anywhere in the world would be at risk of jail. And that includes us, Tom. So we might have to cancel that holiday.
But this is awful stuff, of course. And one wonders what was so important to the British and Americans that they would create the situation where they are displacing these people. Why was that island of Diego Garcia so valuable to these countries?
Yeah, and so for listeners, Diego Garcia is the largest atoll in this archipelago, and it's the only one that was kind of large enough to host both sheltered water for ships to dock and a runway. The reason was very simple, that at the time, there was no base between the Mediterranean and the Philippines. And so this was a very important location for the Americans to have control over the Indian Ocean. And as a result, the deal was with Harold Wilson that we then got cheaper Polaris nuclear weapons, missiles for Trident. It was something of a transactional exchange.
The great irony, I think, is that the United States actually chose the Chagos Islands as a suitable place for a base because it didn't have an indigenous population beyond those descendants of slaves and then freed workers. And so it was felt to be safe from the United Nations decolonizing agenda because there wouldn't be a meaningful independence movement.
We've now got ourselves to 1982, where this seems like it was a settled deal. The problem, however, was the Mauritian government didn't necessarily see it that way. And there were agitations on the part of the Mauritians to reclaim this territory. And there were small legal cases, one over things like the creation of a protected marine area, which the International Criminal, the UN ruled we couldn't have done. But these were effectively trivial matters until...
Well, hang on. There's also some context here, which is that when Mauritius became independent, this nascent country agreed that it would not have a claim to the Chagos Islands and accepted money in return for accepting the lack of a claim.
Exactly. We paid £3 million to Mauritius.
That money explicitly was there to pay for our taking control of those, or our retaining sovereignty of those islands for good.
So it's not quite for good. It was for as long as there was a defence case. And I think the point is there's basically been very bad faith action on the part of Mauritius in that this agreement, as you say, is somewhat unclear, but the deal effectively states that we have control, can have this base as long as there is a defence need and we have control over it. There was an agreement about fishing rights, so Mauritius claimed that they should then still have fishing rights. The problem is when they then wrote their constitution, they acted as if this deal had never been made. And this kind of bad faith action has been what has motivated a lot of the then later court cases against Britain, is that they have effectively accepted the money and then gone back on their word and are now coming after us, like the Danes and the Vikings who we tried to pay off. And
yeah, it's funny. You just give them money to go away.
You give them money to go away, and they
come back,
and they just keep coming back. Who on earth could have predicted this? So this is now the situation we find ourselves in, and because Britain has not really been focusing on this area, and Mauritius has been, there has been these long-running legal disputes that slowly but surely Mauritius has gained small victories. That in the last Conservative government, it reached a point which they felt confident enough to challenge Liz Truss on the borders of a international conference. And Liz Truss, slightly in her, as was her wont, panicked.
Well, she didn't know her brief, right? Because she was new. Was she new to the job of foreign secretary or something?
This was when she was prime minister. And panicked and was caught out in a similar way to when she was foreign secretary and was challenged by Sergei Lavrov about Britain's position over various Cyrillic sounding oblasts that she thought were in Ukraine and were actually in fact in Russia, and she had to be corrected by the ambassador.
Well, she said we will never accept Russian sovereignty over whichever oblast it was, and it turned out that this oblast was alreity owned by Russia,
had long been
by the world as such.
Exactly, and Liz Truss was not actually making a claim on Russian sovereignty. I mean, she was played by far more experienced and capable diplomats and international actors.
And this has been Mauritius' top priority in foreign affairs for decades,
exactly.
I imagine. And it hasn't been ours.
hasn't been ours. And so we've basically got bounced into this situation where successive governments who've been distracted by domestic affairs have found themselves in a position where they've promised things as almost without meaning to.
Concessions to kick the can down the road.
Exactly.
Rather than create a big international hullabaloo.
Exactly. And this...
Well, because Mauritius has made some friends, hasn't
Mauritius has made
powerful
some friends.
friends.
And this came to a head then with Mauritius asking International Court of Justice to pass a
non-binding resolution.
A non-binding resolution on the question of sovereignty.
But they had support from Russia and China.
Exactly.
In terms of both preparing the case and on the court benches themselves.
On the court benches themselves, where a lot of countries and in the General Assembly voted against Britain and for this, what they called the incomplete case of decolonisation of the Chagos Islands. And so it was in 2017 that the UN General Assembly voted or requested the International Court of Justice to actually rule on this matter. And in this, this was a general vote, and we lost this by 94-15. And again, as you said, Mauritius has made a lot of friends, but it was also regarded by many nations as an opportunity, basically, to kick Britain. That we were, the former colonial power, and this was an opportunity to humiliate and reduce us. And
it's easy to see why other countries would see this through the frame of colonialism. It happens to be the case that these islands were not inhabited before the Europeans arrived.
Yeah.
But to mind that they're used to seeing the world in terms of oppressor versus oppressed, this would be a pretty clear-cut case.
Well, and it's very similar to the case of the Falkland Islands, in that these were non-occupied. They sit kind of close to a revanchist power who doesn't like the way of the land and actually wants to use every weapon in their arsenal to try and expand their own local power. And then once the ICJ had been requested in 2019, they delivered this advisory opinion that you that referred to, and saying that this was a case whereby the decolonization of these islands was not complete. And as you said, it's an easy framework to put it into, but it's one that actually doesn't really apply here. And then the last kind of straw that broke the camel's back was the International Tribune for the Law of the Sea in 2021 sort of supported this ICJ ruling and said that Britain should hand over the archipelago and effectively set a time limit on it.
But again, it's not legally binding.
It's not legally binding. And actually this question of whether there should be any talk of it was out of the question until in 2022, when then Foreign Secretary James Cleverly accepted that they would reopen conversations. And I think it's an important thing to remember. This is not just Labour wokery.
No, it's Mauritius having its toe in the door and then its foot and then a leg, because this has been such a priority for them.
Exactly. And now we've got ourselves to the position where Starmer, and who is a lawyer himself, so thinks in these legal terms, Lord Hermer, who's his Attorney General, who has acted repeatedly against the British state, supporting Gerry Adams and other claims against the British government, and Starmer's friend, Philip Sands, who
enemy of the show,
would not be welcome at any dinner party that I host. His attempts to ingratiate himself with North London dinner parties have earned him one fewer invitation from me, I have to say.
Well, he most egregiously planted the Mauritian flag on Chagos soil.
Exactly.
He's been representing the Mauritians for a very, very long time. And I think has spoken publicly of the pleasure of humiliating Britain.
And also has received Mauritian citizenship in recognition of his activities on Mauritius's behalf.
I think the steel man for these guys is not the colonial frame, which, as we've said, doesn't really hold up in this case, but the existence and the importance of the international legal and moral commons. It seems good in the abstract that there's a legal third party that can arbitrate, that can make judgments on these conflicts, right?
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And for a lot of these characters, so Starmer, Philip Sands, Hermer, the existence of these courts and the rulings of the courts are a way of maintaining peace and stability and security of the world. That it is only through these legal means that the world can be prevented from descending into local powers, bullying nations to get what they want, and that a moral and what is moral and what is right can be maintained on the international stage.
The problem is this court is imperfect. It's not the impartial third party that we would hope it to be.
Yeah, and I think we see this in a lot of cases where these courts, which are, made up of lawyers and judges from all across the world, often vote in highly partisan and highly self-interested ways. And I think the best example of this is the attempts by Western countries to get UN resolutions on the behavior of Russia and their invasion of Ukraine. Even though Russia can, at the Security Council, can veto it, and at the General Assembly, there have been repeated votes by often these African countries who supposedly should be anti-colonialist, but supporting Russia. And I think it is worth pointing out the hypocrisy and self-interest of a lot of these parties when voting on what should be moral and legal questions.
Well, there's a Chinese judge on this bench who voted for Britain to give away the islands, who I think historically has supported the CTP in whatever rulings they desire. Similar story with the Russian judge. This strikes me, and I'm going to reference a 90s Simpsons episode here as a case of the wallet inspector saying to, do you recall this bit from The Simpsons? Where
Unfortunately, Tom, this maybe says something about our podcast, that this is the most modern reference that we can sum it up.
Well, for listeners who were not around to watch The Simpsons on BBC Two and Channel 4 in the 90s and early noughties, there's an episode where Homer goes to college and becomes friends with three very unworldly, gentle nerds. Homer's antics get these nerds expelled from the university, and the first thing that happens when they're outside the gates of this safe environment is that Snake, the local criminal, walks up to them, claims that he is the wallet inspector, and they then hand over their wallets saying, like, "I think that's all in order, sir." And Snake scurries off, sniggering, and then the nerds turn to each other and say, "I don't think that was the wallet inspector." And I fear that Britain is in a case where we are handing over our wallets and we are about to turn to each other and say, "Hang on, I don't think that was the wallet inspector."
Yeah, and I think it's also ironic, right, that at this moment in time when the rules about international conduct and what is right seem to be collapsing as America retreats from its position of moral arbiter and moral policeman, that we are, the satrapy of the American empire, its yappiest lapdog, are so eager to keep up a system that has, been repeatedly shown to be a flawed, a biased, and a prejudiced one against us.
Well, my understanding from speaking to civil servants is that there is a fear in the government that this non-binding judgment will continue to contribute to intolerable international pressure on Britain to give up the Chagos Islands, and a feeling that we will not have the moral authority to try to do anything to do with international, that we will not have the moral authority to comment on anyone else's territorial disputes, and that the international commons will be weaker as a result, as well as our own position as one of having some soft power left.
I think that's true, and I think it's true that that's what civil servants are saying, and this is very characteristic of the issue as a whole, that the government has thrown out a number of spurious reasons for why it's so important that they hand it over. And this is one of the examples that at some point, some more binding rule will come down the line. It's never expressed what this ruling will be, who would give it, and how it could possibly be enforced. The UN, after all, does not have an army. There is no international policeman. And it falls in among these succession of cases where things like the Universal Postal Union, which is a UN body in charge of the world's postal policies, has said that Chagos Islands, or British Indian Ocean Territory island stamps, very pretty stamps, by the way, Tom.
Put them in my collection of the British Antarctica Territory stamps.
Yeah, if you like stamps with sea slugs on them, these are your stamps. Has said yes, has blocked the use of these stamps, and then the government threw out some. The government put out some claim about that there is a national security need.
Yeah, that was one of the most insane statements I've ever read from the government, because they said, and I think I'm quoting pretty much verbatim, the electromagnetic spectrum would cease to work on the Chagos. It all goes dark. Like there's no heat. There's this black hole at the center of the planet.
Well, yeah, exactly. That the International Telecommunication Union would rule that other people could also communicate in this area and that satellites would cease to function, which expresses such a profound misunderstanding of how these systems work.
A remarkably optimistic view of the international equivalent of state capacity.
Well, exactly. Yeah, if the Chinese want to build a massive Faraday cage over the Chagos Islands, more power to them. Good for you.
Highly Sino-futurist.
Highly Sino-futurist, exactly. And I think we bring up China. It's very relevant that whilst we claim that this would damage our soft power and our ability to weigh in on territorial issues.
Well, this does make me recall how, of course, there was international outcry over China seizing Tibet in the 50s. And as a result, China has no soft power and has never invested in a country like Mauritius. Nobody takes what it says seriously. It doesn't have a Belt and Road strategy across the world. It has neither hard power nor soft power because of its international condemnation.
And it doesn't have a...
Same with Russia.
Same with Russia. And it doesn't have a soft power council. And yet, in a recent rankings, China moved above Britain in a ranking of which countries had most soft power.
But they haven't got a soft power council.
They haven't got a soft power council.
How can they be climbing the rankings? Don't get me started on giving James Bond away.
It shows up the emptiness of a lot of these claims that fundamentally this is a question of hard power, of how able are you to influence other countries. And this is not achieved by goodwill and the showing of one's belly, but instead with a very large carrot and a very hard stick, which is what China has very effectively done. And I used to live in Senegal, and what was very striking there was that the roads and the schools made by USAID or the European Union, funded by USAID or the European Union on them, and the ports and the military bases had funded by China on them. China has a very real and very hard-nosed attitude to what people actually want. And we are looking like numpties playing this, dancing the steps to some arcane dance whilst they show us up for fools.
Yes, again, I'm reminded of the Warwickton Spectre. It makes our government looks very naive at this point, I think.
Exactly. And I think this doesn't even get us onto the question of the deal itself. Because as I mentioned earlier, the government has already given money to Mauritius, saying that these territories would remain British for as long as there was a defence need. And this is
which there remains.
Which there remains, and an ever greater defence need.
Yeah, because these islands are very useful geographically for containing China in the Indian Ocean.
Exactly. And whilst
our friends in Taiwan, I think, will be quite dismayed by this proposed handover.
Well, I mean, Hong Kong is another good example, right? And Hong Kong is a very close parallel, because we signed with China this agreement that you'd have one country, two systems, that Hong Kong would be able to maintain its independence and its separateness. And yet what we've seen is a progressive trampling on those rights that our supposedly ironclad deal was meant to secure. And the same thing now is happening with Mauritius.
Because there's a proposed deal.
We've signed deals. We've signed deals in the past. And yet successive Mauritian politicians have used this as a nationalist drum and banged it.
Imagine that.
Oh, yeah. have banged this, very bad drum to bang.
Our drum is much more tuneful than theirs.
Exactly. Well, we play it better.
Well, to be fair, when we talk about the Antarctic Treaty, as we do often, we don't talk about breaking it. We talk about doing as much as we can within the confines of the treaty, and then being prepared for the rest of the world to want to come up with a new arrangement. We just don't want to be at the back of the queue when that happens.
Which potentially reveals us, Tom, as also vulnerable to the wallet inspectors of the world. that whilst we might consider ourselves hard-nosed realists, both Sergei Lazarov and Snake would run circles around us.
All too dovish on this podcast.
Quite right. Many people are saying that we are lily-livered and weak.
Well, speaking of, there is this proposed deal.
And so finally,
remind the listeners what's in it.
After James Cleverly's reopening of negotiations and the new election of a Labour government, negotiations
bringing in Hermer
and
Starmer,
Philip Sands,
who are friends, of course, of Philip Sands.
Who has helped Mauritius for years now on this case, trying to win the sovereignty.
So we basically voted for the wallet inspection party.
Exactly, and then were surprised when the wallet inspector came around to call. And this deal is still shrouded in a lot of confusion. So the initial conditions were that we would have possession of these islands, have a lease on these islands on this base for 99 years with the option to extend it further, and we would pay 9 billion for the privilege to keep using the thing that we had always been using.
Well, and the government was secretive about this sum, wasn't it? It took a question in Parliament to elicit this. And we know that Lord Kempsell, friend of the show, and has been banging this drum in Parliament.
Very tunefully. Yeah, so the government has been very secretive about it. And then there was the deal looked ready to be made until there was an election in Mauritius itself. And a new leader came in who called the deal treasonous and a failure, and it failed to
secure. Quite agree.
a rare case where the Mauritians and I are in complete accord. But
he thought it was treasonous for a different reason.
And negotiations were reopened. And
he thought they were not asking for enough money.
Not receiving enough money, exactly. Don't pay the Mauritian geld is the line that is coming out.
Well, this is the King of Norway being like, no, yeah, boys, you need to go back and ask for some more money.
And once negotiations were reopened, and the terms seem to be, and again, we say this with some question around it because the terms have not been made public, that this would be inflation proofed, i.e., that the amount of that the sum would rise with inflation, and also that there would be a front loading. And some have suggested that the true figure now is more like 18 billion, though it's worth saying that the government has objected to this figure.
This builds whole high-speed rail lines in continental Europe. Like, you could build multiple power stations for that kind of money. It's difficult to get your head around how much that is.
Yeah, exactly. And it sits rather close to the figure that Rachel Reeves gave as the huge black hole in the UK's finances of 22 billion. And one has to wonder, and parliamentarians have made this case, that why are winter fuel benefits being cut and this large sum of money being paid out, is it being paid out to Mauritius? Why is it felt to be so important to give over this money? And this is, I think, is what we're trying to get to the bottom of with this judicial review, is to ask, what are the reasons for this activity? Because the publicly given reasons make little to no sense. And so there must be internal ones. And that's what I think we need to ask, is why is the government so determined to hand over these islands when the case is not at all clear-cut and is, if anything, quite a weak one?
Listeners, we're going to cut for a break there. Calum and I are going to have to head to the Falklands for our sunny day on the beach. We'll be back with you shortly.
Please don't nick any other territory while we're gone.
Our first ad is from friend of the show, Joe Reeve. Joe founded Future House and is also in cahoots with Lawrence Spaceport with the Looking for Growth campaign. Now, Joe has written us a letter, and despite
using a Chagos Island stamp.
Using a Chagos Island stamp and the Universal Postal Union, compelled by British soft power, knowing that we're going to give away the Chagos Islands, has dispatched it all the way to the King Charles III space station. Now, I'm just going to open this letter. It says, "Dear Tom and Calum, fantastic show. Can't wait for your episode on judicial review and the Chagos Islands. I am looking to work with or hire from the UK's Techno-Optimist network. Then you should check out the new job site for cracked talent in the UK. It's launching soon. Sign up now to get notified. The website is cracked.london, and it's the network for hiring techno-optimists in the UK. Thank you, Joe."
Tom, we actually have another letter. The sheep farmers of New Tasmania have sent us a card requesting that we draw attention to the tragic decline in the amount of wool that people are wearing. They've even included a cassette and have asked us to play it live on the air. So here it is.
The Haute Cloud Rouge sheep that we breed are hardy animals that roam the Comet Highlands beyond Neptune, grazing on CO2 ice deposits and silicate materials. The wool that we gather from under their chins and the oxygen-generating gizzards is one of the finest quality and has been used as a high-performance material by the joint Canadian, New Zealand, Australian, British centathlon team at last year's Olympics. That is why we are launching our own line of high-performance tweed. Suitable both for hardcore athletes on the track and in the gym, as well as just for a stroll to the shops, the subtle herringbone pattern is both classy and classic. And it comes in brown, dark brown, light brown, chocolate brown, and pink. Designed for everyday use, the material is breathable, but able to maintain pressure in a hard vacuum. Select from our range of leggings, graphic tees, and three-piece suits. Look for the four-horned mark of New Tasmania to ensure it is genuine. Buy New Tasmanian today.
Listeners, welcome back. Calum and I remain in the King Charles III space station. We spent that ad break on the beach in the Falklands, so we are just hanging our swimming trunks up to dry in front of the fire. Calum, so far we have discussed the history of the Chagos Islands, the government's reasons for giving them away, and in this second half of the show, we'll talk about what can be done, if anything, and what we could do with the islands if we kept them.
Yes. I think it's worth at this point also bringing up the topic of the Chagosians themselves, because rather like the international court rulings and a lot of this discussion about them, about the affairs or what's going to happen on Chagos, it has ignored the Chagosians themselves, who do have certain definite opinions about what they would like.
Well, in a bit of a recap, they are the descendants of slaves and indentured labourers who were brought there by European colonisers. Those who lived on Diego Garcia, is it just Diego Garcia, or like those who lived on Diego Garcia, which is the home of the military base, were evicted by the Brits in the 60s, paid off, but clearly that cannot really compensate these people for the loss of their home. Now, on the one side, they have the Mauritians who have made it illegal for people to talk about a Chagosian homeland, and they've got the Brits who turfed them out, gave them some compensation, but could have done better. But the problem is that nobody, including the Brits, has asked the Chagosians what they actually want.
Yes, exactly. And it is in Mauritius's interest for these people to not be given the opportunity to speak, because, as we've said, the Mauritians regard any questioning of the right of Mauritius or the right of the Mauritian people, defined fairly narrowly, to possess the Chagos Islands as punishable by a severe fine or up to 10 years in jail.
Cuff me.
Tom, the Universal Postal Union will come after you.
My stamps, my Antarctica stamps.
At the same time, though, I think it's also worth remembering that Britain has actually already paid compensation to the Chagosian on the condition that their claim to return to these islands was given up. So, in many ways, I think it speaks to the short legal memory of the government that even though this matter was, to all intents and purposes, a settled one, by not really paying attention to it, motivated actors have been able to reopen questions that really, by rights, should have remained closed.
So, and opinion is somewhat split over this, in that there are some Chagosian activists in Mauritius who have supported the deal, but the large group in Britain, the Chagosian Voices, have themselves submitted a pre-action letter and are also pursuing their own legal efforts to try and block this, which, as part of their attempt to get the government to recognise that if this is an attempted decolonisation, then handing the territory to Mauritius is simply handing land from one overlord, if I use that word potentially a little tongue-in-cheek, to another overlord. And that this is no colonisation, this is just another process akin to the transfer of the islands in 1814.
Well, all our Chagosian listeners will have one question on their minds. So will all our loyal Anglo-futurist listeners. How can this government giveaway be stopped?
Obviously, I am launching this judicial review. And horrified as I am and holding my nose at the use of judicial review as this very blunt weapon that has previously gummed up the system of our country.
Our judicial review is proceeding on 3 grounds. And these are, firstly, that the government has no right or power to cede sovereign British territory to a foreign power without Parliament voting. Our second ground is that this is unlawful expenditure, in that we are spending money on this deal which cannot be made, or these payments cannot be made without parliamentary authority. And finally, that this is an invitation to Parliament to legislate on what we regard as an erroneous understanding of international law, by which we mean that because Parliament is sovereign and is able to override international law where it sees a question of national interest, then Parliament is not required to listen to international law where it contradicts or goes against our national interest. And I think, because of course I would add to this that we agreed with Mauritius, or we have signed a deal that in international arbitration between Britain and any Commonwealth or former Commonwealth country, the International Court of Justice will not have jurisdiction. And again, I think it speaks to the nature of international law, that whilst these deals have made, there is no one checking that these are held. And these proceedings are governed not by law, but by power. And as Britain becomes weaker, we see people taking advantage of our weakened state.
Our aim is to question the government's actions in making the decision and force them to reveal these secret and hidden reasons for why they feel it is so imperative to rid themselves of these troublesome islands.
What are those secret reasons?
Well, this is the question that we aim to find out. And we've aimed to force with the courts, and by using, and there is something of a precedent here, with Gina Miller going to court in an attempt to prevent the government.
Friend of the show?
The enemy of my enemy is my friend, I think, in this scenario. And this attempt to halt what she saw as illegal and dangerous activity of the government on the international stage. The other option, of course, well, not of course, for everyone.
all our listeners have an extremely detailed knowledge of every bit of constitutional legislation in this country.
But the other option, of course, is actually a 2010 act called the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, whereby MPs can actually delay the ratification of a treaty infinitely. And this has never actually been used before. But I think what we are really trying to do...
But this is the equivalent of playing for time, getting the ball by the corner flag, and hoping that someone will come along who can help you, right? The only way that this would work would be for Labour MPs to rebel and to hope, I suppose, that the next government that comes in would actually nix the treaty.
Well, and I think there has been some promising noise on this. Some Reform MPs have said that were they to come to power, which, as current polling suggests they might, they would immediately cease to stand by any agreement.
And this is really unusual, right?
Very unusual. And I have to say, I think, if we're going to be honest, this probably damages our soft power and the way that we are regarded internationally more than the continued possession of these islands, because it reveals our
capacity to self-soil.
Exactly. The willingness of our parliamentarians to sabotage ourselves and for domestic issues to be, well, we're airing our dirty laundry out in public, right?
What is the Tory stance on revoking the treaty should they come to power in the next election?
So no Tory MPs have come out and said that they wouldn't stand by it.
Well, Rob Jenrick is a massive critic.
Rob Jenrick is a critic, but he hasn't yet gone as far as stating that the deal would not be stood by.
And of course, he's not the leader.
And of course, he's not the leader.
The Tories, so he wouldn't be able to say that anyway.
There has been little to nothing from Kemi Badenoch. Maybe actually 5 years after the deal is signed, she will get out of bed and issue a statement. But as of yet, we're not holding our breath.
Imagine, Calum, that you are successful in your judicial review and that this deal does not happen and that we Brits hold on to the Chagos Islands and we don't have to pay loads of money to keep them, can we do any better than simply using it as a landing strip for the American Air Force and Navy? Because I have proposals, some alternative proposals for the destiny of the Chagos Islands, and we will return to those. But there's one point I think we should cover, which is the safety of the base in the event that the deal does go through. So as a reminder, under the proposed deal, we would retain use, if not sovereignty, of Diego Garcia, which is that key base that we share with the US, and we would hand over the rest of the archipelago to Mauritius. Why, Calum, do people think that might be foolish?
There are two reasons why people think it's foolish. The first is that it's a 99-year lease with the opportunity to extend, and this right to extend has been criticised by the Mauritian Prime Minister as treasonous and the giving up of sovereignty. So the question of whether even it is realistic to assume that right would continue is, I think, a live one, and people are not necessarily appreciating, as I said, the level of bad faith that the Mauritians are negotiating in.
Well, they just anticipate the spectacular payday, right?
Well, and it will be a significant portion of their GDP will be provided by this.
And then one potential outcome is that the US just simply buys the archipelago off them again, so they get this double payday for doing jack shit.
And we are the chumps who have given them this gold mine. We had the goose. And we didn't just slaughter
hello,
it.
Goose Inspector.
It's a dangerous world out there. The second risk is that, unlike this slightly naive fear about loss of rights to control the electromagnetic spectrum above the islands, that when the Mauritians gain control of the rest of the archipelago, Chinese intelligence and signal gathering,
because they are friendly with Mauritians, right? They've invested in Mauritius.
Exactly. That there would be Chinese signals intelligence built on these neighboring islands, that this economic exclusion zone and the right to police who approaches the island would then be in Mauritius's hands. And the Chinese are well known for having a semi-official merchant navy who are effectively extensions of the People's Liberation Army Navy, which are fishing boats that hold signal snooping equipment that can sniff up intelligence and beam it straight back to Beijing. And so the fear is that not only would the future of the base be compromised,
so we get to keep a tiny bit of the hen house.
The fox is in the hen house and has effectively got his mouth. He's got his mouth open underneath the hen's,
but we've been
hen's
promised.
arses. That actually, your eggs might be going. Your golden eggs are going. Your new chicks are being eaten. But at least the hen itself is still alive. And I think
we've been promised that the hen will not be eaten.
That the hen would not be touched. Exactly. Tom, I don't know about you, but I personally think the best course of action is to not let the fox in the first place.
I don't see any problem with this arrangement. I think we can trust that fox. There remains this question of the huge amount of money that we are promising to lavish upon the Mauritians. And we've touched on this already, and this will be excruciating to listeners, I'm sure, but perhaps we could go into a little more detail on what that money could otherwise fund.
Yes, this is not a trivial amount of money, and as I have pointed out, the true number will probably sit somewhere between 18 billion and 9 billion. And even at that most conservative estimate, this is money that we could be spending on more Anglo-futurist aims. Namely, our good friend Days of NHS Spending has a tool that allows one to examine just how much money, just what money could be used on instead. So if we say 9 billion, this is only 2 weeks and 3 days of NHS spending. So it could be spent on that. However, instead, we have some suggestions of alternative uses that this could be put to, namely a single South Korean style nuclear reactor.
Wait, a single nuclear reactor?
A South Korean design. South Korean designs should be said.
The very best.
The very best.
The very best.
A lot cheaper than any that we are able of building in Britain.
And they all get cheaper once you've built the first. So really...
Exactly. The economies of scale. If you build one of them, the next ones, it's basically buy one, get one free.
The Amersham nuclear reactor.
Exactly.
With apologies to all our NIMBY listeners.
They stopped listening years ago. Alternatively, this could fund 17 Type 26 frigates. This could fund a 9,000 advanced AI training runs. Or Tom, I think the one that you will like is 125 coronations of King Charles III.
Each one better than the last.
Exactly. And also, the other point is not only are we losing this money, but we're also giving up this possession in the Indian Ocean.
Well,
which the Seychelles are already a prominent tourist destination, and my parents actually went on their honeymoon.
An important Anglo-futurist fact-finding tour.
went on holiday to the Seychelles. So I hope, Tom, actually, that when I marry my beautiful, wise, and highly
many
capable
female listeners of the show should be advised that Calum is single.
Exactly. So if you like the sound of
both of us are single.
If you like the sound of a honeymoon on the Chagos Islands, then it is in our interest to preserve it and
send a Chagos stamped envelope to the space station.
But tourism is actually the least, I think, ambitious aim. And Aris Roussenos, our
who wrote the canonical essay on Anglofuturism, contributor to Unheard, for which I work, but whom I do not represent in this podcast.
Exactly. I think actually he would prefer that our silly suggestions were not linked to him in any way.
Nevertheless,
he wrote a very good essay a couple of weeks ago, describing Britain as a dowager aunt who has all these possessions, these jewels,
fantastic property portfolio
that she now doesn't know what to do with. That we have these possessions.
Is the word he uses.
Say that again.
Unworldly is the word he uses.
Exactly. That have it clutching pearls, the gems, the earrings that never get worn and are growing dusty in a jewellery box, whilst the dowager aunt sits in bed. The correct thing to do is to regard these as a use them or lose them attitude. And just as we said about the British Antarctic Territory, this is an opportunity for us an opportunity that we should be using. And we know that our friend of the show, Peter Haig, has suggested that Britain is well placed for polar orbits, launching mass into space in a north-south direction. But the Chagos Islands would actually be a very fine place to launch in all 4 cardinal directions. So it would be suitable for all types of orbit.
Well, so equatorial orbit, for instance, which is where all space stations apart from ours reside. And if you fire something into orbit around the equator, it simply requires less energy than it does if you're doing it towards the poles. So just as the European Union fires the Ariane rocket from somewhere or other close to the equator that's owned by France,
French Guyana.
Yeah. We could very well be doing something similar with Diego Garcia, if only we put our minds to it, if we became less of a bystander and more of a protagonist.
The other possible examples are, we've already talked about the reclamation of Dogger Bank from the waves, but France actually has its own possessions in the Indian Ocean. So Réunion is the island that they have fully incorporated into France, and it sends its own delegates to the National Assembly, and it is considered part of France. It is another alternative that we could consider of expanding this territory and building a British city in the Indian Ocean.
Sending Concords over tourists, space engineers,
business. We already have various like tax havens that are centers of various legal or not so legal money movements.
I've got a friend who's in the British Virgin Islands right now. So a shout out to him as he
for legal reasons.
for legal reasons.
No, but it's a perfect place for, if you pardon the pun, shell companies.
Get out of the space station. Get it. Go on.
No, so I think the thing that we need to be thinking is not how we can, when the ICJ tells us to jump, we ask how high and then add an extra couple of meters above that, but rather thinking, how can we as a country be maximizing the utility and the interests of the British people, rather than thinking, how can we spend British taxpayer money and resources on the abstract concept of global utility?
Well, I think this is one of the things that sometimes you and I differ on, Calum, whereby I'm more dovish than you on global utility. But I think ultimately, if you care about global utility, you should also want your country, if you consider your country to be an avatar of good values, to be powerful. It seems important for the world that Britain retains and increases its military strength such that it can underwrite arbitration of the kind that we would expect of the ICJ but don't receive.
I think that's quite right, and I'm not going to come out and say that this system of international law is wrong and should be totally abolished. I think if anything, it is to our immense credit that we have attempted to stick so strongly to it. And the problem, however, is that the system is being abused by self-interested actors, and actually the world would be a better place if Britain was able to stand up and as you say, underwrite the correct legal and moral behavior of international states. However, what we're seeing in a good example is Ukraine, that even effectively on our doorstep, the nations around us are vulnerable to violent attack, and we are not able to respond to it. So if we want to have any kind of voice, the line goes, speak softly and carry a big stick.
What to think about, as Tom Jones, an interview of ours, has said, when Britain abolished slavery, not only among the British, but worldwide, you cannot do that unless you had the most powerful navy. You cannot simply ask other countries to stop being barbaric and to do so just on the basis of having a good film and TV sector, having that soft power. It doesn't work.
Exactly. It doesn't work. The softest of power is a gunboat, unfortunately, just over the horizon.
One final point on all this, I think, is that there are certainly parts of the Western world that are seeing through international bodies like the ICJ. And while we might not all be fans of the Trump administration's approach to international norms and international bodies, certainly we can sense that the wind is changing. There was hope that the Trump administration would stand in the way of the Chagos giveaway. It looks like that might not happen, and I fear we're on our own. It might well be Calum against the world.
It was always thus. But I think actually it speaks to our own humiliation that people like us were crossing our fingers that the Americans would veto this deal. That it should be a source of humiliation to us that... And I think there is a part of me that wonders whether the Labour government themselves were actually hoping that they could have a sort of get out of jail free card by appearing to look moral, and yet then being able to say, "Oh well, nasty Trump blocked us, so we can't do it." We should, if Starmer truly believes that this is the moral thing to do,
which I think he does,
he should have the confidence to drive it forward. And as we genuinely believe that this is not the moral thing to do, it is our duty, and I see it as my responsibility to stand up and oppose what I would argue are treasonous activities by the government.
Well, Calum, I'll say some words to you, which I'm sure you often hear, which is that we will see you in court. Thanks for listening.
Goodbye.